Hi, I'm Tom Savidge here with ALECtv, and today we have the Tell-All. Today we're talking about tax and expenditure limits with economists John Merrifield and Barry Paulson. Tax and expenditure limits are an important variable in rich states, poor states for calculating economic outlook, and Doctors Paulson and Merrifield have done extensive research on the subject. So while we get started, Barry, why don't you tell us a little bit about what tax and expenditure limits are and how they function?
Sure, Tom. As you know, the problem at this point is that all governments are experiencing debt fatigue, and especially state governments. And it's sort of under the radar because a lot of this debt is off the books. Many states create state enterprises, universities, healthcare facilities, transit facilities, and they issue their debt without much control or constraint. And of course, the big problem is unfunded liabilities in pension and OPEB plans.
Oh, we know that all too well here at ALEC.
Well, you've done a great work on this.
Thank you.
And the problem, of course, is that this is the most rapidly growing source of state debt, and it's really out of control. So obviously, the fiscal rules in place now aren't working very well. So we've been working on tax and spending limits as the most effective way to address this problem of debt fatigue. And the problem is that many states have tax and spending limits. The majority of states have them, but they're not very effective. But there are about a half a dozen states that have designed good tax and spending limits, the best example being Colorado. Colorado's Tabor Amendment, Taxpayer Bill of Rights Amendment, has been the most effective constraint on the growth of government at the state level. And there are several reasons for that. One is that it limits the rate of growth of state spending to inflation plus population growth. And then any revenue above that is returned to taxpayers in the form of tax rebates or tax cuts. And also what Tabor does, it requires supermajority vote if you want to spend emergency funds. And perhaps the most important provision is taxpayer approval for any increase in taxes or debt. Any level of government that wants to raise taxes or raise debt has to have citizen approval. And what we've discovered is that this is the most effective. And by the way, Texas this year adopted, as you know, a Tabor-type limit, limiting the growth of state spending to inflation plus population growth. Now, John and I are also working on a refinement of this kind of this tax and spending limit, and it's called a debt break. And the idea of the debt break, and this has been introduced in Switzerland and a number of European countries very successfully, and the basic idea of the debt break is that if your debt increases to a level that exposes your state to the possibility of unsustainability of debt, you lower that spending limit. You reduce it below inflation and population growth. And so John and I have been simulating this type of tax and spending limit.
Yeah, that's amazing. You guys have done great work. And before we get into a little more into the calculators you guys are working on, you mentioned that there were different types of tells across the states. John, what other types of tells have you seen, and why aren't they as effective as, say, Tabor and Colorado?
Well, let me just use Florida as a good example. Florida is kind of the poster child of good behavior on the fiscal front, but it's not sustainable in the sense that we can count on it continuing. The person that the current governor beat barely would surely have vaulted Florida way above its trajectory of not growing spending any faster than even inflation and population growth. So there's no constraint in place to sustain their good history. The tell is not binding. In other words, the spending growth doesn't bump into that ceiling. Fortunately, because the ceiling is too high, it's just symbolic. It's a limit that is never hit, so it's really not a limit. So that's true for a lot of tells. And then there's a tell like the one in Colorado and a similar one that preceded it in California, where it was so stringent and it lacked a few characteristics that the voters objected and gutted it.
Wow.
The Gann Amendment, the Tabor Amendment have both been weakened, the Gann Amendment much more than the Tabor Amendment. It's because, well, in the case of Tabor, it didn't have a budget stabilization fund, so there was like a roller coaster ride of some years not spending a little bit more than the year before. And so then, what was it, in 2005, there was a voter referendum that significant, well, it had a 5-year timeout first, and then it significantly weakened the Tabor Amendment. And in California, I mean, they're the poster child of fiscal irresponsibility because there are so many huge gaps, huge loopholes in there. And I mean, it's still there, the Gann Amendment's still there, but it's easy for legislators to play games with it to avoid its constraints.
Yeah, that's bad news. That's bad news for for California. Now, I know you guys have also looked at the difference between, say, constitutional tells and statutory tells. So what are some of the differences between the two, and which do you find is the stronger tell?
I think the empirical evidence is pretty strong on this. The constitutional tells are much more effective, and of course, Tabor is the classic example of an effective constitutional tax and spending limit. And as John said, I think the statutory limits are too easy for legislators to circumvent, and especially if they're defined, the expenditure limit is based on income growth or some other measure. Many of them simply are not very effective. So it's that combination of an effective limit based on inflation and population growth and additional rules that makes it most important.
Well, of course. Now, you guys have been working on a project called the Friedman Project, and that involves managing a website called vetfiscalrules.net. Why don't you guys tell us a little bit about Vet Fiscal Rules and how the project works?
Well, let me just address the name, the Friedman Project, really quickly. Milton Friedman was, of course, a well-known scholar that espoused rules to guide both fiscal and monetary policy.
Of course.
And there's been some dimensions of the monetary part in our work as well to connect fiscal and monetary. We see at the federal level that they're intertwined now. We're printing money to finance increased spending growth. So we're looking at rules-based management, mostly of fiscal policy. We don't have a budget. It's just a spending plan because there's no external constraint on the amount to spend.
Of course.
And so the first and really the only short, I mean, we're talking periods of many years still, the only way we're going to get back to where we actually have a budget, either at the state level for some basket case states or at the federal level, is to restrict the rate at which spending can be increased. Then there's an external constraint again. Then the amount spent is actually a budget.
Oh, okay.
Let me just add to that, Tom. I think that as John said, the Friedman Project is a very broad-based project. We're really looking at many different issues that we think can control the growth of government, better fiscal rules, and of course better fiscal policies. And I think this is especially important now because I think what we're observing, especially at this point, is government's too big, it's too expensive, it's too intrusive in people's lives, and especially in the wake of this pandemic, think of the many ways that the government regulates where we live, where we work, how we travel. So basically, we're focusing on rules that would help us restore not just economic prosperity, but economic liberty, which of course is the ALEC foundation.
Let me add to the constitutional versus legislative. In the legislative case, it has to function by moral suasion, and we just don't have enough of that. Legislators are under enormous pressure to spend. I worked for the Southern Institute for a few years here in Utah, where the legislature is Republican, the governor was Republican, and I visited with some of these folks, and I said, these are as conservative folks as we're ever going to elect, and yet they were increasing the budget as fast as revenue increased short. I mean, every once in a while they'd knock a couple $100 million snippet tax cut out of a multi-billion-dollar increase in revenue. Yeah. So they're under the same kinds of pressures, and as I concluded to my colleagues at the time, if Utah needs a tell, everybody needs a tell.
Oh, of course.
And as a statutory tell, you can just, as part of the budget process, nix it or say to avoid it. You can't do that with the constitutional.
Oh, of course. And then, for everyone keeping score at home, Utah has been ranked #1 for many consecutive years in rich states, poor states, and it's of course the best state and a model for sound tax and fiscal reform, but there's always room for improvement, as you guys had said. And I loved what you said, John. If Utah needs a tell, that means everybody needs a tell.
Right.
Tom, if I could add to that, I think in our research, we look what happens in these states if they do adopt effective fiscal rules. And we simulate that over the past couple of decades.
Yeah.
Basically, we divide states into 3 different categories. Most states are like Colorado. Colorado has become a blue state. And in Colorado, the debt has increased to levels that are risking the sustainability of that debt. And so with our fiscal rules in place, we can lower that debt to a sustainable level, and we show that. And we can show that in most states with these effective fiscal rules. However, there are zombie states, and you're well aware of Illinois.
Yep.
We simulate our fiscal rules. We can't get debt to a sustainable level over any reasonable time frame, 2 or 3 decades. And as John said, in our 3rd category are red states that are conservative states. But even in Florida and Utah, mainly because of unfunded liabilities in pension and OPEB, they have also increased their debt substantially and risk the sustainability of that. So even in these conservative states like Utah, they need these fiscal rules to maintain that debt below the level that exposes them to the risk of default. So I think these fiscal rules are relevant even in conservative states.
You know, and it's a good thing to give legislators something to point to as a constraint when somebody's demanding that they spend more money on something. Instead of having to say, no, Mr. or Ms. Constituent, I disagree, which is tough for them to do, they can say, my hands are tied, we have a limited amount of money, we're prioritizing that, here's how we're going to spend it.
That's it.
We're against a limit, we can't spend more.
Certainly, and then I'd want to mention too, you guys have both a federal and a state calculator, and very recently, the Friedman Fiscal Rules Project has started partnering with ALEC on the state calculator, and we look forward to working with you guys on that and getting the calculator shopped out to our members, and getting them active, getting them using it. And I've played around with it myself, and it's it's just fascinating stuff. You guys, like you had mentioned, both forecasting and backcasting, doing a sort of what-if scenario. What if we had instituted a tell 10 years ago? What would spending growth look like compared to what actually happened? And I think that information is going to be absolutely essential, and just being able to visualize that, not only for legislators, but for every stakeholder in the policy discussion. Because at the end of the day, whatever government does, somebody has to pay for it. As Milton Friedman mentioned, there is no such thing as a free lunch.
Absolutely.
Right, so, and Tom, what you just said about others other than state legislators, yes, their aides and the legislators themselves can design a tell and simulate it through our state calculator and see either through a forecast or a backcast what would have otherwise happened to gauge the impact.
Yeah.
That said, they need to be held accountable, because sometimes they really are interested in just spending as much money as they can, and they need to be accountable, for example, by their state-based think tanks or by ALEC.
Yep.
So that calculator is an important tool for those people to hold them accountable, and given legislators are busy and maybe don't have very much staff, it's the think tanks that can design some of these tells and present all of this information to the legislators, who we found are somewhat reluctant to plug numbers into a calculator.
We can help put it in plain English.
Right.
And
or just run the numbers for them.
Of course.
Yeah.
And on that note, since I asked Barry the first question, I'll give John the last word. But
all right.
Question for both of you. If there was one key takeaway about tax and expenditure limits you want our audience to know, what would that one key takeaway be? Barry, you'll go first.
Oh,
John, I'll give you the last word.
Though. All right.
Well, I think the key for me is an effective spending constraint on the rate of growth of state spending. They don't have to cut spending. They don't have to reduce government. The key is reducing the rate of growth of state spending and using effective fiscal rules to achieve that.
Or in the case of Florida, to make sure that their existing slow rate is sustainable. But adding to what Barry said, the next most important thing, in addition to the TEL being actually a constraint and slowing spending, is that it be sustainable politically. It has to have something like a budget stabilization fund as part of it. It needs to have an emergency fund as part of it. It needs to be able to handle counter-cyclical issues. That if you go into a recession, there's got to be something in the calculator that automatically, without creating a giant loophole, that automatically allows a boost in spending when personal income growth is down. So without those provisions, you can have a really nice, strict-sounding TEL, and it may last a few years, as in the Gann Amendment in California, and do awesome things, and then it gets gutted and it goes away.
Oh, of course. And on that note, Dr. John Merrifield, Dr. Barry Paulson, vetfiscalrules.net, and you could also check out
coming to ALEC soon.
Coming to ALEC soon. You could also check out their book, A Fiscal Cliff, available online or wherever books are sold. And they also have a couple other books coming out as well, right?
We do, yeah. We're there in process, Lexington Press.
Right, we have a book looking at debt sustainability from an international perspective, and some really outstanding economists from Europe, from Latin America, and the U.S. And this at the national level, of course. And Lexington Press has this in press now, and this will be published probably by the end of the year.
Excellent. You also had a state fiscal rules book coming out as well. That
manuscript is sitting on Lee's desk.
All right.
And well, we'll see.
Yeah.
he didn't jump on it because it's a big deal to process something into a book.
Of course. Thank you very much for your time, guys. I'm Tom Savidge with ALECtv signing off.